Scott Rogers. I am currently the chair of the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. This is our December meeting. Appreciate your joining us today. And the Mark I've been talking to is Mark Quam. He's our secretary treasurer and is our Zoom master. So we appreciate him setting everything up for us to be able to put on this program and do it by Zoom, which is particularly appropriate today. I am going to share my screen. And you should be seeing just a map with some information about the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition and our contact information. Mark, is that correct? Is that what everybody's seeing?
Yeah, I'm seeing that on my screen, and yep, I can see it.
Terrific. Zoom is great. It's actually my favorite remote platform, but when you're a presenter and you're sharing your screen, you don't exactly see what other people are seeing. So it's always good to check on that. And I made a mention that today is a pretty snowy day in West Central Wisconsin. I'm looking out my office window and it looks like a winter wonderland, but for people who had to shovel snow this morning or trying to travel, it's not so great. It looks like this to a lot of people. And one of the reasons we're working as a West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition is to have some alternatives on days like today, as well as any day where passenger rail might be an alternative way of traveling or primary way of traveling and still getting through. The top picture is from Facebook. It's the Empire Builder in Minot, North Dakota, running on time despite all the snow. You probably recognize the North Star from the Twin Cities in the other picture. So here's information about the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition. If you are new to us, we serve this area of Wisconsin. And our mission is to provide leadership and coordination to develop passenger rail service. And we've done that as a strategy to have a balanced transportation system for economic growth for our area and to provide important mobility to our communities and citizens. These are the directors and officers of the organization right now. We have 9 directors, 3 officers who are elected from the directors, and then a couple ex officio. We were started by the Momentum West Economic Development Organization. So Steve Yon, their director, is an ex officio director, and Eric Anderson, who is our Metropolitan Planning Organization director, is also on board this morning. And did want to let you know for your calendar, we do an annual meeting in January per our bylaws, and we have set the date for that. It's going to be on Thursday, January 26th at 8:30 a.m. We appreciate the fact that Chippewa Valley Technical College is going to host it. It's at their business education campus on West Claremont Avenue in Eau Claire, a very good facility. That facility also will make it possible for us to do it hybrid, so we do expect to make it possible to attend that remotely, although we'd encourage you to come to Eau Claire and interact with our members and constituents. We will have more information about that available soon, but get it on your calendar. What I'm going to do today is give an update on where we are in our goal to have passenger rail service from West Central Wisconsin. There are a number of things happening right now that are valuable and we believe are leading us in that direction and getting us closer than we've ever been for that. A little bit of background. This is a map of the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative, of which Wisconsin was actually one of the leading states to develop a network in the Midwest. This was really developed in the 90s. And if you would happen to zoom in on our region, you would see that there's no solid line, but a dotted line to Eau Claire, which represented a bus connection. And community leaders in our area at that time said, we have a growing some growing metropolitan areas of Wisconsin, and we really don't want to be left out of this. So how could we be included in future rail planning? And so the initial efforts of the Rail Coalition were to literally get on the map and to ask Wisconsin and Minnesota to include our area in their passenger rail planning. WisDOT did come out with a report in 2004. The map here shows that their report indicated that it was financially feasible and worthwhile to include our corridor in future rail planning, either as a standalone Eau Claire to Twin Cities corridor or as a through corridor as additional service along with the current Chicago to Twin Cities service through La Crosse. In subsequent years, the Minnesota rail plan included the Eau Claire to La Crosse corridor as part of their phase 1 network. And the current Wisconsin rail plan also includes this map, which talks about future connections serving our area and acknowledging also the Minnesota rail plan. So that's something we've been on the map, and there's more maps that have come out since then. This is the Amtrak Connexus plan that came out last year, which they released a national vision as to locations that they thought future rail passenger service would make sense with an increased federal commitment. Here's a map from the High-Speed Rail Alliance, based in Chicago, but their director, Rick Harnish, has spoken to us a number of times, a vision map for Wisconsin that also incorporates direct bus connections, as well as some further routes that could be developed beyond what's in the state rail plan to serve areas like central Wisconsin and the Beloit-Janesville area. And then also last year, the Federal Railroad Administration released a vision for a regional rail network for the Midwest, very high level, other than the cities you see designated here, such as on the Chicago to Twin Cities. They did not specifically say which route it should take, but indicated that Milwaukee and Madison were worth including in the route because of their ridership potential. And that is a planning document that will be helpful in the future in terms of priorities from FRA. FRA is a division of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And the Chicago to Twin Cities corridor, if you can't read this map, it shows it as a core express, which is really the highest level of service, and indicates to me that it's one of the most important corridors, and one that eventually they say should be true high-speed rail, but that you would take an incremental approach to get there. So the Rail Coalition, to get service to our area, we went through kind of a desert through the 2010s in terms of not a lot of movement for expansion of passenger rail, especially in Wisconsin. And we started looking around to see successful efforts in other areas of the country where real estate development or public investments in stations, things like regional rail authorities that took control or had major influence in services, even if they were operated by Amtrak, were things that we looked at, and we learned a lot from that, and it's informed our efforts going forward. We also know that the Chicago to Milwaukee Hiawatha service has been one of the most successful corridors in the country. It's had 7 round trips daily for quite some time. Before COVID, ridership was nearing 900,000 in their trips throughout the year. And the state has been working to get capital improvements done and other planning to eventually increase that to 10 trips a day. And then our most significant new expansion in Wisconsin is actually about to happen. If you hear the words TCMC, that stands for Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago. And that's a project that Wisconsin and Minnesota have been working on. They successfully obtained federal funds for capital improvements, as well as some federal operating support for the initial 3 years of the service. And you're seeing a map here of a second frequency that will operate between the Twin Cities and Chicago over the current route. They are hoping to start that sometime in 2023, somewhat likely in the first half of the year as they complete the capital improvements. And as you can see in their planning, they also included direct shuttle connections to Eau Claire, Rochester, and Madison, which we hope will be part of the implementation. And we know is something that's done successfully in places like California, where a substantial part of their ridership on their routes, where they do provide direct connections to offline communities, has been an important part of the success of and growing ridership in those communities. And one of the things that Wisconsin and Minnesota talked about in terms of the public investment that went into making this possible is that the economic impact of passenger rail investment can be significant. And as you add this type of service and additional alternatives for people to take advantage of passenger rail service and have connections for their communities. There are a number of economic impacts that help the community that go well beyond the cost of putting it in place. And so there's certainly some capital costs and some operating costs in getting the service started. But the calculations that the states made was that there's an economic benefit to Wisconsin of $25 million annually every year after taking into account the costs of providing the service. So that's going to be an increasing thing as we consider passenger rail expansion, is how do we measure and talk about the value it provides beyond just do the fares cover all of the expenses. So as we go forward, we look at, for our region, how would we get passenger rail connections for our area? And we really are looking at a few things. One is, as our communities considered how can we jumpstart this and get something going, and we also recognize the significant commerce that takes place in the corridor between Eau Claire, Menomonie, Baldwin, Hudson, River Falls, and the Twin Cities, that given the distance and the fact that it's sort of digestible size, frequent regional service between Eau Claire and the Twin Cities could be important, and it's recognized particularly in the Minnesota Rail Plan, and it's also in the Wisconsin State Rail Plan. And so that's an effort we've been working on for a while. There is also the possibility of through service, and that would be our goal as well, so that we could also go east to Milwaukee and Chicago. And there's a few ways that may happen, and they may all happen. TCMC, I mentioned before, as additional trains are added from Chicago to the Twin Cities, there is serious consideration to having frequencies that run via the route through Eau Claire, Menomonie, and Hudson. We know the FRA Midwest plan points to Chicago to Twin Cities through services. And long distance, there is a Amtrak study getting started, or a federal FRA study getting started on restoring some long distance or new long distance services. And one of them being seriously considered with a lot of support in Montana, North Dakota, and other places is the southern Montana route on a Chicago to Seattle route. And certainly it's a possibility that from Chicago to the Twin Cities, perhaps the Empire Builder could continue running through La Crosse and the new service through Eau Claire. And that remains to be seen, of course. And then going back to the TCMC implementation, throughway shuttle connections to existing Amtrak stations. So for instance, WISDOT last year showed us a potential schedule with an idea that shuttle could start in Menomonie, go to Eau Claire, and then to Toma. And the way that would work is you would be able to purchase an Amtrak ticket that actually would take you from Eau Claire, let's say, to Milwaukee, and it would include the direct connection at Toma, so you wouldn't have to drive or you leave your car there. Or if you were somebody that didn't have a car available, or a student or others, that would give you that alternative. So those are some of the things we've been working on as far as what kind of service we could envision for our region. So I want to talk about the thing that has moved us much closer that has occurred within the last year. In November of 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed by Congress last year was signed into law. And you probably heard that it includes substantial investment in a number of areas of infrastructure. But when it comes to passenger rail, it is historic and really game-changing. This is a table from the Federal Railroad Administration that shows the amounts that are in advanced appropriations, for example. And what's different about those is there's 5 years of funding that has already been appropriated and isn't subject to annual appropriation efforts in Congress, which sometimes sputter and take a while to happen, or don't happen as fully for the money that's been authorized. And so this is kind of hard to read, and it gets complicated to explain all of these different programs. But you can see things like the federal state partnership for intercity passenger rail, the $36 billion there. Those are programs that are primarily under the control of state and local governments and FRA. So FRA will actually make the decisions about that money based on applications that come in from state and local governments. So that could be for new Amtrak service. It could be for other things. One other that is notable is the restoration and enhancement grants. And those are operating grants from the federal government that have a declining support starting at 90% in the first year of operation of a new service, over 6 years, a little bit less each year. And that gives a community or a state who is getting a service started some time to build up a ridership to cover more of the costs and to determine if it's successful. So here's another table from FRA talking about that shows just how significant these numbers are. So fiscal year 2022, that's highlighted in red here. If you were to take all of the years before that and stack them up over the last 10 years, it actually exceeds 10 years in just 1 year. And then that's going to go on for 5 years. So it is historic, it's significant. And I have had the opportunity to hear FRA representatives talk about these programs recently, both at our Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission and also at the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. I'll come back to those a little bit later, but FRA is committed to getting this program rolling, and they want to see some positive activity very quickly. In May, they came out with a Federal Register notice that they are establishing something called a Corridor Identification and Development Program. And that's the methodology they're going to use to determine what corridors are eligible for the federal funding. And they haven't come out with all the details yet, but they started to say, here's some of the criteria we're going to use. It's things like eligible entities are states, local governments, regional transportation commissions, and others. And they invited people initially to do something they call an expression of interest. And that is, if you're an eligible organization, to sort of raise your hand and say, we have a corridor we're working on, and we intend to ask the FRA to put it in their program. We are waiting for FRA now to provide the next stage of that program at presentations I heard in both October and November. They have talked about mid-December as far as a release. We're on the 15th yet. Right now, we haven't seen it yet, but they have indicated it will be very, very soon, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So this is some of the overview that they've talked about as to why they're doing this program. They really want to build a national network and not just do it piecemeal. They want it to be a long-term program. They want to bring world-class passenger rail service to regions across the country, and have a number of other goals to achieve with this. And this table might be a little bit hard to read, but it's the one that is fairly significant in terms of what the program is going to look like. And if you go on the columns from left to right, there are the things that need to take place to take a corridor and either improve existing service or establish new service. And so the first thing you see there is an expression of interest. That's really like taking a number or raising your hand and saying, we're anticipating a corridor that we're working on, and we hope that you will designate it as a corridor. Next step is going to be submitting corridor proposals, and that's the notice that we're waiting for from FRA, where they're going to ask entities who've submitted expressions of interest or are qualified to actually ask FRA to include a corridor. What's interesting about the way FRA has described that process is when you apply for a competitive federal grant, usually it's a lot of work, and you have to have every I dotted and every T crossed and have a really strong case. And then once you submit it, you wait for FRA to decide if you were successful in getting that competitive grant. FRA in their presentations have indicated that this will be a more dynamic process where they will consult with corridor sponsors as to, are they being too ambitious, not ambitious enough? Is it part of a larger corridor, but a more consultative process? And we don't know quite what that's going to look like, but they do seem to be committed to finding a way to find the right corridors and those that have strong public support. So the next three things, if you look at the very bottom line, indicates how the funding is going to work. And if you submit a corridor and it's accepted, FRA is anticipating providing $500,000 in what they call seed money with no required local match. And that would be money that could be used for additional planning to really get into some of the issues that really would help you understand better what it's going to take to develop a corridor and whether it'd be successful. So things like ridership studies, looking at what capital improvements are required, et cetera, would be part of that process. And then the transportation planners who are on today would understand some of this, but next stage is something called a service development plan. That would be a 10% match from the sponsors. And then the rest of implementing a corridor, which would include the environmental requirements, as well as then future capital improvements that might be needed to start the corridor equipment, acquiring equipment, et cetera. That's a 20% match. So that means 80% federal funding for most of the program, 90% federal funding for the planning activities, and 100% federal funding for that very upfront work to get the corridor ready to be further planned. Why that's significant is up until now, not only has the federal funding for passenger rail not been very robust, but the local funding has been much higher. Up until now, states have been required to provide 100% of any funding requirements, subsidies for their own services for operating. And then capital, they either have to do the 100%, or if they do get successful CRISI or other federal grants, typically they've been around 50%. And so this is a much richer federal program. It still is going to require state and local funding to implement, but at a much lower level. So I'm going to keep going here, if that's all right, to get through all of this. But I'm sure there'll be some questions about these things. So we want to talk about a little bit of the vision, where how do we take advantage of this here in Wisconsin, and specifically for our region. I'll go back to the state rail plan. So the routes that you see here have already been identified by the state as future passenger rail routes. So that's a important factor in being considered for the FRA program. It's also, here's the Minnesota area plan for our route, we're also in the Minnesota plan. So that's a positive. One thing I'll mention about the state rail plan is, those of you who've been following know that the state has been working on an update, and we're told that it is in final draft and that we should be seeing it in early 23. And so that certainly will inform some of this. We don't know how the timing will work with a FRA's program. What we do know about, and I don't know if I forget, and I apologize if I didn't mention this, FRA in their presentations have indicated that once they announce the opportunity to apply to have a corridor in, it'll be about a 90-day window to make that application. So one other thing that, actually an important thing that our region has done to help ensure that we're part of the planning, that we get attention from our state and from the FRA, is that the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission was formed last year, and it was formed by resolutions passed by the county boards in St. Croix, Dunn, and Eau Claire counties, and the city or village, city councils, village boards in Altoona, Eau Claire, Menomonie, Baldwin, New Richmond, and Hudson. State statute does allow municipalities and counties to get together to have transportation commissions to do planning and other activities. And so it was done under those statutes, and that also makes it eligible to interact with the FRA on programs. And in addition to the government agencies, organizations who are members of the commission also asked the West Central Wisconsin Rail Coalition to be a regular member of it, a voting member. And then the commission invited those that would be involved in implementation of the service to be ex officio members, and they have been participating as well. And that includes the Union Pacific Railroad, on whose tracks the services here would operate, the Minnesota and Wisconsin Departments of Transportation, The counties in Minnesota, Ramsey and Washington County, where the line runs, West Central Wisconsin Regional Planning, our metropolitan planning organization for this area. And then the 5 institutions of higher learning are also participating. That's UW Eau Claire, Stout, River Falls, CVTC, and Northwood Technical College. And we've appreciated their efforts there as well. The coalition is a member, and the coalition board, we actually have 2 voting members on the commission, and the 2 voting members are Ann Schell, who is on our board, as well as me. And so the commission has been meeting regularly. Actually just had a meeting yesterday, and I'll give you some more information momentarily about some of the things we've been doing. And we've talked in previous meetings that we did submit 2 expressions of interest to FRA, and I don't expect you to read this, but I'll tell you what it is. This is a copy of it. Jim Dunning, who is actually on our board, is the Eau Claire County representative on the commission, and the commission elected him chair, and so he's the one signing these things. But we did submit an expression of interest for the through service from Chicago and Milwaukee to Eau Claire and the Twin Cities, and we submitted an expression of interest for the regional corridor between Eau Claire and the Twin Cities. So I'll talk about how these things are moving forward right now. I mentioned earlier the Amtrak Connexus plan. Amtrak has been actively talking about how it would implement this plan in Wisconsin if these corridors are designated by FRA and that funding becomes available. This is a slide that Arun Rao, who's Director of Network Development for the central part of the country, with Amtrak, presented to the Wisconsin Association of Railroad Passengers this fall. So it's a map that shows prominently, of course, shows our region on it, and some vision as to how it could be implemented. So increasing the Hiawatha services, they're trying to get up to 10 round trips a day, extending some of those trips to Madison, implementing another TCMC service in addition to the new one starting next year through La Crosse that would operate through Eau Claire, extending 2 to 3 Hiawathas to Green Bay. The Northern Lights Express is the Twin Cities to Duluth service you see on the map that Minnesota's been working on, and then get access to Minneapolis. One of the deficiencies right now of the TCMC and serving both cities in the Twin Cities is the need to address how you'll get all the trains that operate through there stopping in both St. Paul and Minneapolis, and that's certainly going to be important to ridership. Here is just a little bit bigger version of the map if you want to see it a little bit better. And if you remember the state rail plan, these are the same routes that are currently in the Wisconsin state rail plan. The other expression of interest then that we've indicated, so we know Amtrak is working on that through service, is the regional service we've talked about between Eau Claire, Altoona area, and the Twin Cities, initially between Altoona, Eau Claire, and St. Paul, Union Depot, running on the tracks of the Union Pacific. So that's the map you see here with stops anticipated in Menomonie, Baldwin, Hudson, with a connection to River Falls, possibly Stillwater, and ending at St. Paul Union Depot. And we are also pursuing a potential pilot of a different concept. Way back when I showed the slide that talked about other regions, one of the regions that has taken a different tack would be the state of Connecticut, where they added service between between New Haven, Hartford, and Springfield, and they hired a company called Herzog to operate it rather than Amtrak. And the companies you see here, Herzog, Keolis, Transdev, RATP Dev, are contract operators of commuter services primarily. They have a trade association called the Association for Innovative Passenger Rail Operations. And as the bipartisan infrastructure law rolls out and communities and states look at implementing additional passenger rail services, and also knowing that Amtrak has been constrained somewhat in capacity to expand its system and even operate the current system, they have indicated that they have a strong interest in working with sponsors of services on a contract basis to have some competition for who the operator is. which is what happened in Connecticut. Each of these organizations actually operates a substantial number of services. So for instance, Herzog has services in the locations you see here. Some of the ones that are notable are the Rail Runner in New Mexico that runs between Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and Point South. And you probably won't be able to read this, but these are some of the services that these organizations operate. Herzog is a US-based company that operates a number of services, also does railroad construction. The other organizations are international and not only operate services here, but in other countries as well. So they have expressed a strong interest in being a contract operator for this service. Union Pacific has been interested in how that might work in terms of the relationship, and working through the commission. What the Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission has done is hired a consultant, Ray B. Chambers and Associates, to work with AI Pro and the railroad to investigate how that might all come together. So they'll be, they're doing something called a market sounding, where they look at the feasibility of the operations, they look at insurance requirements, equipment, the relationship with the host railroad. We actually had a meeting in Omaha on Monday with the Union Pacific that was very positive. And we talked to them about capital requirements, how we would get at that, the kind of agreement that would need to be in place to operate on their tracks. And one of the innovative ways that they are interested in going forward is finding a way to treat the passenger service as a positive piece of business for the railroad. If a reasonable market rate access were provided by the passenger carrier, the railroad may not require as much upfront capital, because they would be selling current capacity to the rail passenger operator instead of requiring that their current freight capacity be built out and the passenger service handle any capital to maintain that. So that gets a little bit into the weeds, but it's an innovative way to look at that, and is something we're pursuing to see the feasibility. Next steps on that will be a more robust meeting in January or February, most likely February, to look at all of the pieces of that and how the public and private sector would be involved before the corridor is submitted to the FRA. So I do want to mention one other thing, and I know I'm covering a lot of information, and I'll be glad to answer any questions in just a minute, but some of you who've participated in this know in the past that I've talked about the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. That's the 8 Midwest states that work together on passenger rail coordination and development. It ranges from North Dakota and Kansas, includes Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Missouri. I may not have mentioned all of them, but they come together. They were formed through legislation, and they're recognized under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as an Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, and they're also eligible for some additional consideration and coordination authority by the FRA through the law. I am actually serving as one of the 4 slots for Wisconsin. I was appointed by the governor as the private sector representative, so I've been attending the meetings. And actually at the meeting in Indianapolis in November, we did things like hear from FRA. We also learned about the long distance program that Amtrak and the FRA are working on to examine new long distance routes, or taking some of the current tri-weekly routes to daily. And one other thing that MIPRC is doing, it is applying for a CRISI grant to do a broad study of the Midwest routes and look at the FRA study, which is very high level. I showed the map earlier, and how that could be implemented in the Midwest and what the next steps might be. So that grant application went in on December 1st, and we should be hearing, it'll be a few months probably before we hear whether that's accepted, but that'll be something for us to follow as well. Part of the effort of that is to include all of the state rail plans and how could those be implemented under a coordinated Midwest network. Also, I should mention at the meeting, the commission has 3 officers, and the officers for the coming year are going to be Carolyn McGinn. She is a Republican state senator from Kansas. Peter Anastor, who is the manager of the Michigan Passenger Rail Services, is the vice chair, and I'm actually the financial officer as a private sector person. So I'm now an officer, and I'll be working on some of those things as well with MIPRC. And finally, I have one more thing to talk about, and this was actually the subject of our last meeting, public meeting, and that is we are working with my counterparts. I work at, of course, the Eau Claire Chamber of Commerce as Government Affairs Vice President, and we are working with our counterparts at the Green Bay Chamber, the Milwaukee Chamber, and the Madison Regional Economic Partnership to build some business support for passenger rail expansion in Wisconsin. We developed this statement that we are just now starting to ask businesses to sign on to indicate to state policymakers that this is something that's important to Wisconsin. I think it's widely acknowledged that the Hiawatha Corridor has been very valuable and very successful. And those of us in other parts of the state who have rail passenger routes that we believe could be economically successful and have a big economic impact ought to be considered in planning as well. And so services up through the Fox Valley to Green Bay, through Eau Claire in west central Wisconsin, Menomonie, Baldwin and Hudson River Falls, as well as to Madison, are things that ought to be considered in the planning. And so if any of you are businesses in Wisconsin and you're interested in adding your business name to this, we would love to talk to you, so contact me. And then just here's a few dates to be aware of, and then I will open it up for any discussion or questions. We are expecting that FRA notice of funding opportunity for the corridor identification program. So we are carefully watching the Federal Register when that comes out, and that'll be an important thing to watch, because there'll be that 90-day window to apply for a corridor designation. As I mentioned before, we have our annual meeting on January 26th. Before that, the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission has a couple meetings coming up. If you are interested in sitting in and listening to those, they are also available via Zoom. And their meetings are going to be on January 18th and February 15th. And we certainly go into a lot more depth as far as the work of the commission and the market sounding process with the AI Pro carriers and Union Pacific. So once again, if you wanted to grab some of I have my email address here if you need to get in touch with me, some of the information about the Rail Coalition, the region we cover, and how to get in touch with us. So hope I didn't have anybody's eyes glaze over. That was a lot of information to cover. I think the exciting thing now is 5 or 10 years ago, we were trying to find ways to keep the ball rolling and talking about passenger rail service. And now there are a lot of things happening that we can take advantage of, and we hope some or all of them will come to fruition. So thanks for your time, but I would be glad to, I stopped sharing, so I'd be glad to answer any questions or open it up for any comments anybody has. And I think you can just speak up if you'd like, otherwise I can watch for anybody raising your hand.
Scott, this is Jeff. One comment, one question. Going back to the slide of the study progression you had with the early applications as such, going through each step. My comment, and I'm sure you know where I'm going on this, is that background information is about 90% all the way through that whole slide that we have in the files right now. So I'm hoping that we are given a little higher consideration from FRA as far as who they pick and the initial studies. My question is, the core area of anti-passenger is starting to ramp up in Milwaukee. And it's the same loud voice that's kind of starting to lead it as was in the past. Should we be starting some more intensive political dialogue now?
Yeah, and actually, Jeff, that's some of the reason for the Business Coalition getting rolling is we think perhaps one of the more persuasive voices with so if not everybody follows the government situation in Wisconsin, we currently have a Democratic governor who was just reelected, and we have a Republican-controlled legislature which slightly increased its majorities. So whatever is done in any kind of substantial way needs to be accepted by both the legislature because of budget considerations and certainly the governor. So they both have a role. There are some vibes right now that there is going to be more cooperation between the governor and the legislature than there was 2 and 4 years ago when they did budgets. So there's some hopeful signs, but as Jeff mentioned, there's been a little bit of that poking at passenger rail service as a stupid idea, things like that. I think you're right, Jeff, is that we need to be carefully talking about its benefits. That's one of the reasons even to talk about the economic value. Sometimes, and I'm probably preaching to choir here, but we don't think about the fact that the gas taxes and other fees paid by road users don't come anywhere close to paying the cost of providing streets and roads. And we see that as a public investment. And getting the same thought process about passenger rail and having credible information that shows the economic benefit can be an important part of that argument too. But Jeff, you're right. We need to be, particularly with the Republican caucus, would be where we need to have acknowledgement that this is of value. One of the questions right now is, given the timing of the FRA processes, is how soon will any actual money be needed, or any substantial money? And I don't have an answer to that yet. And Jeff, you looked at you've looked at that table, which I brought up. You're not talking, I don't know what service development plans cost. I'm guessing 10% of those is not a huge amount of a state budget. It's when you get into the project development pieces that will be more money, but again, the money would be leveraged much more so than in the past. The state did find a way to finance the TCMC, which is and it's been widely accepted that the Hiawatha has been successful. So TCMC starting, getting the Hiawatha, focusing on the Hiawatha and saying that's been successful. What about the rest of the state? There's sometimes a reluctance to support Madison. And so maybe that being the first one talked about more statewide is not the best thing. If you, Fox Cities is much more right-leaning, if you will, in its politics. So if the Fox City starts supporting this, and we do know the business community there is very interested in it. So Jeff, I apologize. There's a really long answer that was really yes.
No, that's okay. The Quandale study, which would probably fall into the step 2 service development plan to some degree, was at least from the 2 states total of 600,000. I don't know if there was any, or what the federal amount of that was, but I do remember seeing a total estimate of $1 million. So, and that's what you got from Quandale.
So if it's $1 million and you need 10%, that's 100,000. Is that, am I hearing that right? Or is it $1 million of state money?
No. It was 300,000 from each state, and then the total. I'd have to do some checking, but okay. I think the total was somewhere around $1 million.
So the budget that's going to be enacted this coming year will cover 2 fiscal years, but you'll see 3-year numbers in it because it would go from July 1st of 2023 to June 30th of 2025. And so the question is, what do you need before June 30th of 2025? And so that would be one of the questions from a budget standpoint. So Jackie has her hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do, Scott. I don't know if we'll get minutes of this, but you did add some documents that, I haven't seen before. And one of them of great importance is what you mentioned, the corridor ID funding. And I'm thinking, I'm hoping to get some of those, to be honest with you. I don't know what the plan is, but maybe you can let me know. But the other part is, in our last public meeting, we were talking about the role of this committee, this group in advocacy, and it's going to be really coming down the tubes pretty soon, where we need to get some of this information out to the public in terms of, I can't tell you how many people ask me these questions. And it's really nice to have those documents, a little bit organized, that I might be able to show even, to be honest with you, because things are happening and it's a good thing. It's a very positive vibe, and the community needs to know this too. And I'm kind of looking at plans along those lines as well, because I think we all have a role to play here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Dan Schillinger's on the line as well, and
Sure.
We've discussed a little bit that the January 26th annual meeting is probably our point to get more awareness, acknowledgement of what's going on. And so updating things like our website with more current information. And I think I'll speak for Dan, but I think if anybody wants to raise their hands and help Dan put all of that together and do some of the work on that between now and the 26th of January, I think he would welcome that. Am I putting words in your mouth, Dan?
Not at all. That would be all help gladly accepted.
Good.
And those that don't know Dan, Dan is you don't look like you should be retired yet. You look, but he's the retired news director for WQOW here. So knows the news biz and communications very well.
That's good.
Anybody else have any questions or comments?
This is Mark Quam. The one thing that I have often wondered, has FRA looked at some of the problems that potentially exist with getting corridors up and running when you maybe can't get some states to get legislative support, to do the state funding? And I just have often wondered if FRA is going to take a more serious look at that. One example I want to point out, and I just learned this at our Tuesday night board meeting with All Board Minnesota, there's a newly elected Minnesota state legislator up in the Duluth area who's anti-rail, and she sent a memo out to the Northern Lights Express coalition that the project needs to stop, and they've wasted too much time. And I just thought that was a pretty brazen statement to make, to the Northern Lights Express organization. And I think often what I think gets clouded here is the fact that a lot of times with these groups, sometimes, especially with some state legislatures, their viewpoints may not necessarily reflect what the majority opinion is of their constituents. And so I think that's something from an advocacy standpoint, I think it's really crucial to find out, what is the constituency support in certain areas of different states, for moving stuff along. So I'm not trying to paint a cloudy picture here, but I think from an advocacy standpoint, and even like with the business association, for promoting, I think that is so critical. And I'm hopeful that, even in Minnesota, maybe they can get a business coalition going to advocate as well. Because I think long term, these could be little, things that could slow things down. I don't think they're total a detriment, but I think it's something in the back of my mind. Everybody should kind of keep that in perspective. So I just kind of wanted to reflect on that.
No, that's a good point. And you do have changes in each state. Minnesota now has a Democratic governor and Democratic control of both houses. In the past, it was a split legislature. The Senate had a 1-vote Republican margin before. What might be worth noting about Minnesota is that Scott Newman, who is the Republican chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, although did not run for re-election, the Great River Rail Commission sponsored a trip to Milwaukee on the Empire Builder in August. and invited a number of state legislators and other government officials to travel along. Senator Newman went on that trip, and I don't think it's just because of that, but he has traveled in Europe and on trains, and really he was at the MIPRC meeting, and in fact his ranking or his vice chair for several years on that committee on the Republican side, who will now be the ranking Republican minority member, was also along, and both of them seem very supportive of the idea of intercity rail as being a good idea for Minnesota. And so, you know, some of these opportunities to expose people to who are policymakers to the value, and then the individual opportunities, as maybe Mark, as you mentioned, if there's constituents in their districts who they hear from that they respect, that talk to them about the value, that might make a difference. So Mark, I don't know if there was concern in your, you know, certainly there's going to be some controversy, and we can't expect 100% of the people to like what we're doing.
No, you brought up a good point, Scott, and I think the main thing is you know, to get the advocacy out there and basically get a general feel for what, you know, people as a whole, you know, whether they support rail. And I think overall, I think there is widespread support. It's just a matter of getting some of our elected officials and leaders on board. And I think it's a process that's going to take a little time, but I think that's where I think groups, you know, with rail advocacy organizations and other organizations, that's really crucial. And I think from a business standpoint, I think that can be a selling point and a strong tool to be used.
All right. Anybody else have additional information that I didn't cover? Some of you I recognize on the screen here have been at some of the meetings I've been at too. So if I left anything out, or you have other questions, we'd be glad to answer them. Everybody wants to get back to shoveling snow. All right.
This is Mark Quam
Yeah.
again. One question I had, were there any additional little developments from the Rail Commission, Chippewa St. Croix Rail Commission, that maybe weren't covered in your general discussion a little while ago? I missed the meeting, so I wasn't able to attend.
Well, we had a really good meeting. It went just a little over an hour, I think. Jim Dunning's on the call too. Jim is chair. Jim, do you think there's anything that we should relate? You sat in on the meeting with Union Pacific remotely as well. Anything else you want to cover that we talked about in our meetings?
Well, I think the thing I came away with was that Union Pacific seemed very interested. They recognize that there's a lot of issues that have to be worked through, and both from their perspective as well as from the commission's perspective. But they had a positive attitude that this could be solved, and they saw, and in fact, one of the biggest obstacles that they see is actually is a rail obstacle, and that's the Westminster Junction over in St. Paul, where all the trains in Minnesota run through at some point in time. So they figure if that could get going, they could. I got the impression that they would be happy both freight wise and passenger wise if that got through. So they could live with the infrastructure that they've got currently.
And part of the process would be, of course, in some of the being successful at getting some of the planning money from FRA could go to looking at a little bit more closely at the corridor and the capital improvements and what operations could you accomplish with the current infrastructure. And there was some talk like starting out with one level of frequency, frequent enough though to make it convenient, and then having a vision for increasing it after you did some improvements like Westminster Junction. But there was a real openness to finding ways to get the service started as soon as possible. And all four of the pro carriers had people at the meeting. So they clearly had a priority on working on this as well.
This is Mark Quam. I'm just kind of wondering, did Union Pacific or the group that met in Omaha, did they potentially plan another future meeting? Or I'm just kind of curious what the short range plan is for reconvening or re-meeting again.
Yeah, well, I skimmed over a lot of information, so I apologize for that. So we've hired Ray Chambers to, the commission has hired Ray Chambers to take this forward to get to the point that there would be an application to the FRA. And he has something called work streams. And so there's some preliminary work. This was the perhaps a critical first step to make sure that the host railroad was on board and understanding what their requirements in general would be. They're also going to be working on things like insurance requirements, what would be the equipment, what would be the labor situation and labor relationships. And it would move all towards probably in early February, a market sounding event where all the stakeholders would come together and help to finalize the proposal. So there would be a broader meeting a little bit later in the process. And in the meantime, some of these other sort of pre-meetings will come together to see what needs to happen to make these aspects of the service successful. Did I get all of that, Jim?
Yes.
Okay. Jackie?
I just have a quick question about the state rail plan. I haven't heard anything about when the draft is ready or et cetera. It seems to me that it's important to get some of this input into that thing, including the options for future passenger rail connections and et cetera. I'm wondering, is it available to read or look at it at this point? Or when will it be?
So I've been, maybe bugging would be the right word, with Scott about this.
Okay,
And Jen Murray, who is the director of the Bureau of Transit, Local Roads, Railroads, and Harbors, sent me some answers to some questions just this morning. And I'll quote from it. The draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 is expected to be released for public comment in early 2023.
okay.
See the project website to sign up for email updates, including the draft plan release and notification of public involvement events.
You'll get that information out in case some of us as individuals can get that information.
Yeah, certainly we'll blast it out there as much as we can.
Appreciate that.
It feels like it's been imminent for 8 months.
Well, it seems like I've been asking this question for a long time, to be honest with you, with little, response on it. And so that bothers me a lot, given that it was supposed to be a lot different than this.
Right. So we'll see. I've been told that they did some high level ridership studies that'll be more comprehensive than
Okay,
the last state rail plan. But other than that, we don't really have any clues to exactly what's going to be in it.
okay, thank you. Well, that's why the draft is so important.
Right.
We don't want it missing things either.
And there will be public comments. So we'll see
Great.
what we see.
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, it's
This is
8:59. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Mark Quam, I just had one quick question. I don't want to put Chris out on the short spot here, but did you have a chance to attend the Madison Station hearing, site locations, or any feedback on that?
I did. It was jam-packed. The city staff kept having to bring chairs into the room. I didn't count, but there were probably 150 people there. Plus, I heard 300 some more on Zoom. So lots of excitement, another demonstration of how eager people are to make this happen. And the key, one of the reasons that I wanted to join you for your meeting here today is that we're all in this together, and it's going to be very important to build statewide support to make this happen. As Scott mentioned earlier, it's unfortunate that there can be a tendency to want to beat up on Madison or deny good things to Madison. So Madison can be a kind of lightning rod, unfortunately. So I think the best way to make this happen for all of us is, for trains that serve as much of Wisconsin as possible.
And it's interesting, the public interest in this, as you mentioned, people are turning out for not just because I'm guessing it wasn't just because it was a site location. When the TCMC update meeting they had in La Crosse and Winona a few weeks ago, they had really much more attendance there than they expected to, because it was kind of a meeting to get input on the capital improvements. And it turned out people wanted to know a lot more about when's the train going to run and what's it going to cost and how soon can we ride it and will there be more trains and things like that. And we know that when we've had events in Eau Claire, a lot of people have turned out over the years too. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. All right, one last chance. It's 9:01. Well, we appreciate everybody joining us this morning. As I mentioned, if you're can be helpful to Dan, I will pass along any emails I get or any contacts to him, or you send them to the Rail Coalition email address, and we'll make sure that happens. So, thanks everybody. Go ahead, Dan.
By the way, I'm actively, one thing we'd like to do is have some more visual stuff on the website. So anybody who's traveled by train and has cool pictures of how cool it is to travel on train, send them my way.
All right, terrific. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great holiday, and we hope that you'll put the January 26th on your calendar, and we hope that'll be a good event to really highlight the value and need and prospects for service in our area. So thanks again.